There are moments when life just throws us some surprises at the most unexpected times, like meeting the woman of your dreams or learning that you'll soon become a father, maybe landing that dream job offer. Then there are other, worse surprises. Allow me to set the scene. It's 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night in Cincinnati, Ohio. The breeze causes me to slightly shiver as I sit at the bus stop waiting for the bus to arrive so I can embark on the hour-and-a-half long trip home from work. I'm a social worker specializing in child abuse. It's certainly not always the most fun job, but it is highly rewarding. I've always had a passion for this work, as growing up, my best friends were abused by their fathers. Because I was a young child at the time, I couldn't pick out the signs. I would only ever become confused when they would complain about the bad nights their dads would have because I had never known my own dad growing up. When it dawned on me as a young adult what had really been occurring in their lives, I knew that I wanted to help children who had been abused and hopefully work to prevent them from meeting the same fates as those three friends. Two of them are currently serving time in prison, and another was murdered in a drug deal gone badly. The bright headlights paint the street in front of me as the bus slows to a stop. It lowers as the doors open, inviting me inside. I walk up the familiar steps and greet the driver, whom I hadn't seen before. He must be new, I think, as I make my way to find a seat towards the back. As is usual for this time of night, the bus is nearly empty, with only one other passenger, an elderly woman sitting towards the front, her nose buried in a book. The bus begins moving again as I gaze out the window, watching the blurry streetlights fly by us, painted against the black canvas of the night sky. I had supposedly drifted off into sleep before being suddenly awoken to the sounds of a man yelling frantically in the bus that has now stopped. I jolt my eyes over towards the front to see the elderly woman who is now laying in the aisle, gasping for breath, surrounded by the driver and another passenger that must have been boarded as I was asleep. The driver is on his knees, evaluating the woman in attempts to assist in any way he can, while the woman continues lying, gasping heavily. The other man pulls out his phone before his eyes look over to meet mine. I quickly get up and hurry over to them. "Hey, are you a doctor?" he asks me. "No, I'm not. What happened?" I respond urgently. "She just grabbed her chest and fell over out of the seat. It looks like she's having trouble breathing." I look down at the woman, who's now looking directly at me, eyes bulging in such a way that causes me to avert my gaze. I shift my focus over to the driver, who is visibly panicked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Okay, where's her purse? Maybe she has an inhaler?" I offer quickly. The other man leaps over to her seat and begins rummaging through the woman's bag. I take a deep breath as I kneel down next to her, reassuring her that everything will be okay. Meanwhile, the driver is back in his seat and starting the bus up again. Both the other man and I quickly look over at him. "Hey, we need to stay here!" he shouts. "The emergency responders are on their way already." "She needs medical attention now!" the driver yells angrily, pointing at the woman still writhing on the ground. "The hospital is really close. I'm going straight there. We can't wait that long for them to get here." The bus lurches forward so suddenly that I almost fall over. The man stands, staring at the driver, bewildered. "Hey!" I inject loudly enough to get the man's attention, who darts his eyes back over to me. "Any luck on an inhaler or something?" The man shakes his head. "I emptied the bag out. No inhaler or meds or anything." "Christ," I say, panicked. I look back over at the driver, who is focused on speeding down the road. "Is there a first aid kit on the bus or something?" I yell, desperate. "I think so. 1 second," he replies as he quickly stops the bus and reaches for a manual in the console. The man and I share a confused, panicked look. "You think so?" the man shouts. "Look, I'm new. This is my first night on the job," the driver says, now furiously flipping through the manual. "We don't have time for this," the man exclaims as he lunges forward into the driver's area, frantically opening up every compartment he can, searching for an aid kit. I look back down at the woman and notice that all of her movements have ceased, her eyes now staring, relaxed, at the bus's ceiling. I jolt my hand downwards to take her pulse. Nothing. Guys! I look up and yell, pointing down at her. The other passenger rushes over and elbows me out of the way before kneeling down next to her. He starts doing chest compressions and continues on through CPR in attempts to revive her. As he's doing so, the bus begins moving again. I look over at the driver and shout, "What are you doing?" He looks up at me again in the rearview mirror. "I'm getting us to the hospital. We're running out of time," he frustratedly shouts. "Hey," the other passenger says, grabbing my attention. "Keep checking for a pulse while I'm doing this." I kneel down and do as I'm told as the bus continues gliding down the street. With my finger pressed against the woman's exanimate carotid artery, I look over to the back bus window and observe that we are moving away from the city, the glow of the skyscrapers growing more and more distant behind us. "Hey!" I shout. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" The driver, once again, looks up at me through the rearview mirror. "Yeah, this is a shortcut." The other man quickly looks over at the back window before leaping up and shouting, "We're going the wrong way!" The driver replies, "Just trust me, okay?" I look to the other man to see that he has quite obviously had enough. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out his phone once again. "I'm calling for help," he begins loudly proclaiming, "because it's clear that this numbnuts has no idea where he's going." My ears are suddenly ringing, and a red mist coats my peripheral vision as the bus jolts to a sudden halt. The man is now lying completely still on the floor next to the woman, his face relaxed, mouth agape, oozing crimson in a fine stream across the metal floor. As I'm still processing what had just occurred, I look over, horrified, at the driver pointing a revolver behind him down the aisle, its silver barrel leaking smoke. Before I could utter a single word, he gets up from the driver's seat and walks over, the barrel of his gun now fixated on my forehead. I quickly throw my hands up, trembling. "Give me your phone," the driver says, calmly, with a ruthless stare. My heart beating rapidly like thunder, I reach into my suit pocket and do as he commanded. He rips the phone from my hand before placing it into his front pants pocket. "I'm not going to kill you as long as you do as I ask. Understand?" he says. I feel the sweat now dripping from my chin and streaking down my neck. I quickly nod. The driver, with that unchanging, cooled expression, replies, "Good. Take a seat right there." With the gun's barrel, he points towards the aisle seat in the second row. My hands still raised, I slowly stand up and walk over to the seat before quickly dropping into it, facing straight forward. Out of the corner of my eye, I see him walk over to the two bodies. He reaches down and collects the phone out of the man's hand. He then walks over and takes the woman's phone, which was lying on her seat next to all her belongings that were emptied out of her bag. He places them in his pocket as well before walking back up to the driver's seat, starting the bus and putting it into drive. We begin moving down the dark road once again. My mind is a scattered mess. My thoughts are free-flowing, my life uncontrollably flashing before my eyes. Suddenly, the driver interrupts the chaos occurring within my head. "Where were you heading?" he asks me, eyes glued to the road. I'm apprehensive to answer. I don't want to give him knowledge of where I live, but I know that silence won't appease him. "Murray and 9th Street, I say, voice shaking. The stop is about 6 miles from my actual one. There's a small pause of silence as I notice the driver give me a quizzical look in the rearview mirror. However, it fades as he looks back at the road, nodding understandingly. "Well," he begins, "play ball tonight, and you'll get there safely." I slowly nod my head, still slightly shaking, as I shift my gaze to the driver's hand resting on his thigh, still clutching the revolver. The fuck does this guy want from me? I think to myself. I then notice that his hand holding the gun is slightly trembling, and that his face exhibits significant unease from the events that had transpired. In this situation, all I could do is rely on my training as a social worker. Drawing on these clues, I can ascertain that the driver is either doing this against his own will, or that things aren't going as he'd originally planned. Either way, one thing is clear. He's visibly shaken, and he looks like he doesn't want to be here under these circumstances. With this in mind, I make a dangerous, possibly fatal decision. I take a deep breath, attempting to stabilize my voice before saying, "I'm not sure what's going on, but this isn't something that's necessary." He looks at me once again through the mirror. His eyes, though hardened, show a small hint of resistance. After a pause, his mouth opens. "If only you knew. You will soon." Okay, I think to myself. I can work with that. I need to keep pushing. I need to know more in order to walk him back from whatever he's planning to do. As calmly as I can, I continue. "You said that you'd spare me. I appreciate that." His eyes remain on the road. I go on. "It tells me that you're not a bad man." With this, his face noticeably transforms, expressing extreme anger. He's now glaring at me. My hopes of keeping him even-headed dwindle quickly. "You don't know me, Stephen," he says in a terrifyingly cold yet calm manner. My stomach drops and the hair on my neck stands straight up. The walls are closing in fast. How does he know my name? I gather myself. I can't display panic and fear. I don't have that option. "But," he continues on, "I'd like to know you more. Let's get better acquainted." Suddenly, he yanks the bus over to the shoulder of the road and slams on the brakes, causing me to jolt forward so quickly that I almost spill out of my seat. My panic becomes obvious. My head quickly begins turning, my eyes darting over to the side of the bus as I desperately try to think of ways to alert other drivers that might be passing. But it's no use, as there aren't any other vehicles around. I gulp deeply, my entire body shaking as the driver uses his free hand to grab a bag from beneath his seat. He briefly peers into it before placing his hand inside, sifting through its contents. While he's distracted, I get the sudden urge to jump up and sprint towards the bus's back exit and force the door open, or break a window and climb out. But before I could act, he stands up and reaches over to me with some papers in his hand. I look at him, confused, before slowly grabbing them from him, all the while trying hard to keep my hand from shaking, to no avail. It's a newspaper. I push it down onto my lap, resting my hands against my thighs, trying to hide the trembling as I begin to read the cover. The Cincinnati Gazette, dated 2 months prior. The headline reads, "Wanted suspect still missing in domestic violence case." Underneath the headline sits a large picture of what looks like a casual vacation photo. It's of a bearded middle-aged man with long brown hair smiling at the camera as he stands in front of a lake. I look up at the driver. He had taken off his hat and is now gazing straight through me. Looking past his clean-shaven state and his bleach blonde hair, I now recognize him. My blood freezes inside my veins as my fear becomes absolutely debilitating. Standing before me is Mark Greiner, a man I had never met but had become all too familiar with in a case file. Here are the details. He was married to a woman named Leslie. This also made him the stepfather of her 6-year-old son, Carl. The case details that Carl called authorities from his bedroom in their house, while a bitter drunken argument between Mark and Leslie had erupted in the living room. During this argument, Mark physically attacked Leslie, leaving her unconscious before fleeing the house, never to be sighted nor heard from again. Leslie fully recovered from the incident and they moved away from the area after changing their identities. But before she recovered, Carl was assigned a social worker to provide therapy for the abusive household Mark had created. That therapist was me. Mark's eyes are latched onto me intently. My heart sinks into my feet. Now knowing that I'd come to this intended realization, Mark, without a word, walks over to his seat. He sits down and puts the bus into drive, lurching us back onto the road. We both sit silently for a moment as he drives on. My mind is in overdrive, taking in everything. The noise of the bus's motor, the creaking of the pull stop latches as they lightly swing overhead. At this point, I feel paralyzed, as if quicksand is up to my throat, just waiting to finally engulf me. I look up and notice Mark glance at me through the mirror before he asks, "Any questions for me?" I could ask why he killed the man calling 911, but it was now obvious. The responders could recognize that he's a wanted man. Of course, I could also ask a million others, but I decide to tread lightly. "Why are you driving this bus?" I ask, entirely unable to hide the agony from my trembling voice. "I wanted to talk to you," he replies calmly. I can barely restrain my panic. I was just doing my job, earning my living doing therapy. I can tell you whatever you want to know about the session, just... "Relax." Mark cuts me off. "I'm not here to bring you any harm." Suddenly, something happens inside me. The fear is washed away and is replaced with frustration and anger. "Then what the hell do you want from me?" I ask, my voice now wavering from the whirlwind of emotions while I look down at the two corpses still lying on the floor. "I'm not a bad man," Mark says, his own voice now trembling. Not from anger, but seemingly from sadness. This causes me to look up at him through the mirror. Tears are welling in his eyes as he continues looking forward. "Just a deadbeat father, as you're now aware." This snaps me out of my emotional outburst of rage. My face softens as I continue silently looking at him through the mirror. Mark pauses before saying, "I loved her, you know." A single tear trickles down his cheek, eyes still locked onto the road. "I loved both of them." I slowly begin nodding, attempting to put on a facade of understanding even though I remain utterly confused. Then a possibility dawns on me. Perhaps Mark is wanting some therapy of his own. This might at least partially explain why he wanted to talk to me. After some deep, silent, calming breaths, I muster up the courage to pry more out of him. "Okay, how did you meet them?" I ask. "She was the first woman I decided to pursue for many years," Mark began. "The last relationship I had at that point had ended badly." I could still detect some emotion in his voice. I gently nod. He goes on. "I was at a bar which had for years become my escape from my past. Then she approached me. Could you believe that?" As he says this, he begins smiling. I mimic this with a smile of my own. "I got to know her that evening and learned that she had a child, a son, 6 years old," he continues. "I fell madly in love with her that night." He mentioned his past. What was he drinking to escape from? I gently reply, "You mentioned that you went to the bar to escape from something in your past." His eyes dart up at me, the anger in them showing once again. I immediately regret asking, but then they calmly return to the road as he says, "Yes." There's a brief pause. He then goes on. "I was 17 years old and had a girlfriend when I lived in Virginia. She meant the world to me, but I was terrified of commitment." I'm nodding again to show that I'm understanding his point. "She wanted more and started talking about life plans." His lip begins trembling. "I hated this and didn't want to entertain the thought of settling down or anything, but she just never stopped talking about it." Now, fresh tears begin spilling down his face once again, his eyes still locked onto the road. Where is this heading? I think to myself. As I open my mouth to speak, Mark continues, "Just shut up. Let me finish, please." I quickly nod again, sitting silently. "When Leslie and I were arguing that night, I was hammered out of my skull, because even my newfound love of the prospect of a family wasn't enough to silence those demons. She called me a scumbag, and I just lost control. I lost control and slammed her into the ground, and without a second thought, I ran away, proving her right and realizing that it's just who I am. There's no changing that." As he was saying this, I realized something. That he jumped forward in the story from his past relationship to the current case, leaving out what happened that haunted him so much for all that time. "Okay," I say softly. He might react negatively to this, I think, but I need to bring him back. I take a deep breath. "Going back to the old relationship you mentioned when you were 17, what ended up happening?" I ask. "You didn't want commitment, but you were 17 years old. That's completely understandable. You were still a kid. What happened then? Did you break up with her?" All of a sudden, Mark jolts the bus back over to the road again. Just as it had previously disappeared, all the panic returned to hit me like a freight train once again. I shouldn't have asked, I think. The bus stops, and bewildered, I look at Mark. He puts his face in his hands, wiping his eyes before looking back up at me. "Yes," he says. "I ultimately broke up with her." I sit silently, allowing my heart to thunder through my body while expressing the pleasant, calm look of a therapist once again. "Let me ask you a question now," Mark says, looking at me with a rather blank expression. I nod, deeply nervous. "Okay," I reply. "What made you want to become a social worker?" he asks. "I've just always had a passion for helping children," I say, hoping that the answer satisfies him. "Why?" he inquires further. I gulp silently. I don't know about this, I think to myself. I guess it's best to put my guard down for a moment and be vulnerable. He's done that for me, but what if my answer sets him off? After a brief pause, I decide to give an answer that's honest but likely the most safe. "Growing up, I never knew my own father," I respond. Mark nods, maintaining eye contact with me in the mirror. That familiar silence befalls us once again. Then he reaches down into his pocket with his free hand. I decide to slightly lean in for a closer look at what he's retrieving to find that he now has the phones he'd taken from us. He stands up and turns towards me. The next thing I know, I am once again staring down the barrel of the revolver. Before I have time to react, he says, "Let's go outside." My mind is once again fully enveloped in chaos. We're in the middle of nowhere, I think. This is where he kills me. "Stand up," he orders. The doors open as I do as I'm told, with my hands raised. I slowly walk over to the front entrance of the bus until I'm in front of Mark. With the gun now pressing into the small of my back, I'm ushered out onto the shoulder of the road. I feel the sudden urge to sprint away. I can probably outrun him, and it'd be hard for him to aim in the dark, but where would I go? We're too far from this city. Before I'm able to contemplate further, Mark walks up beside me before saying, "Let's walk into this field." "You don't have to do this, Mark," I begin, voice trembling so hard I begin stammering over my words. "I promise I won't tell anyone anything." "Shut up and walk," Mark says, pointing the gun at the side of my head. I finally begin to accept my fate. I would have never dreamed to go out like this. I do as I'm told, beginning to trudge forward into the field with Mark by my side, gun pointed at my temple. Is there a heaven? Will I be let in? I think to myself. Surely I've done good things on earth. God, I don't want to end this way. We continue walking until we're fully outside the reach of the streetlight's glow. "Stop," Mark orders. I realize he is now almost 3 feet behind me. I slowly turn around, hands still raised. My face is entirely drenched from tears. "You asked me what happened with that old relationship," Mark says, now beginning to once again shed tears of his own. I nod quickly, looking pleadingly at him, desperately trying to maintain eye contact as if that might convince him to let me go. "I got her pregnant. I couldn't handle the idea of that much responsibility, so I left her without notice, changing my name just before I did so." Through the maximum level of panic, I was still able to feel confusion at this remark. Why is he telling me this at this moment? I'm angry once again. This time, I don't feel the need for politeness or any sense of decorum. "Okay, what does this mean? Why the fuck are you telling me this?" I sputter. Mark's gaze slightly softens before he calmly replies, "Because that woman's name is Janice, your mother." My panic is once again decimated, taking my anger with it. Now I'm dumbfounded, empty-headed, blank. My jaw is immobilized, hanging open, pulled by the gravity of those words. "You're so full of shit," I begin. "Just listen to me, please," he says steadily, tears flowing freely. I close my mouth and stare at him, my vision blurry yet zeroed in on his face. "I studied your routine and got rid of the bus driver," he went on, his voice stabilizing again. "I decided that I've reached the end of my pathetic, miserable time here on this earth." He pauses, trying desperately to quell the emotion that is arising once again in his voice. "Before I made my exit, I wanted to meet you, son." I open my mouth to speak, but no words come out. My throat is entirely closed up. "Before I died," he continues, "I wanted to face you on my own 2 feet and apologize. You deserved a father, but not one like me. You were better off without me." I'm beyond overwhelmed. I'm barely able to focus on his words. This man abandoned me and came back only to say goodbye before he leaves forever. All those years. I just heard my father call me son for the first time. Before I can say anything, with his free hand, he pulls something out of his pocket and, in a quick motion, tosses it to me. It's my phone. I look back up at him, desperate to speak, but the words are still not coming to the surface. "Call the authorities and tell them everything that happened. Now I can go with the biggest amount of peace that could be afforded to me." I can only shake my head rapidly, tears dampening the ground around me as they're completely let loose. "I love you, Stephen." He opens his mouth and raises the revolver to its roof. I leave my body. Without thinking, I raise my hands and rush towards him, crying out the one word I'm able to. "No!" One word too late. My hands are seated neatly on my lap as I stare, expressionless, out the window of the sheriff's truck as the deputies and I venture back to the city, the glow of which is now just above the horizon. All of the families that I've worked with, all of the children who have parents that turned out to be monsters, and yet I'd still always secretly desired to at least get to know my own, that one part of my life that was always missing. I suppose my wish was finally granted, and I will never forgive him for it.